Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we're going to speak about the Pacific Islands, the politics, geopolitics, Indo-Pacific, and all those concepts that we hear and we read about every day. Because every day we have some news coming from the Indo-Pacific region, from Australia, from islands around Japan, Taiwan, China. So let's delve into this topic with someone who knows a few facts about that, and that's my today's expert, Dr. Lorenz Gonschor. Hello.
Hello, Martin. Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Lorenz Gonschor is a senior lecturer at the School of Law and Social Science, Discipline of Government, Development and International Affairs, the University of South Pacific, Fiji Islands. Dr. Lorenz has interest in the contemporary governance and politics of Oceania. Also, he's researching the regionalism of the Pacific Islands, and also he's interested in the decolonization of the remaining territories of the region, such as French Polynesia, Rapa Nui, and Norfolk Island. So I like that Dr. Gonschor accepted the invitation because we can speak with someone who is in the region, who has experience with local people, local politics, and also diplomacy and international affairs. So let's start with the first question, and because those islands are in some sort of proximity to Australia, what is the role of Australia in security dynamics of the Pacific Islands?
Well, so Australia is, of course, the largest power, I guess, in the region in a way. Now, of course, saying in the region is already kind of contested because Australia is, of course, a country that is mainly characterized by descendants of British settlers and not of indigenous Pacific people. So there's kind of a somewhat of a controversy of whether Australia should be rather seen as kind of a European state in the region or rather a state of the region. So that already is kind of somewhat contested. Now, what is not contested is, of course, the fact that Australia is a clearly economically and militarily dominant power in the region. I mean, it has a larger military than any of the small island states. It has a larger economy that's like way larger, many times the sum of the other island states. So, of course, Australia, I guess, plays the role of a regional hegemon. It also is a major funder and the biggest, generally the biggest donor for development aid to pretty much all of the independent post-colonial states in the region. And then, of course, it also plays a role being a major ally of the US and of this Western alliance, especially of the recent AUKUS alliance. But even before that, there was already the NZAS pact with Australia, New Zealand, US. So it has been a major Western ally for like all of its history, and is, of course, in that sense also represents in a way this kind of a Western political power, close partnership with the United States. And of course, in that sense, is also like an antagonist to some extent of China. Now, that of course is also it's qualifiable because Australia at the same time is also economically quite dependent on trade with China. So it also has to tread carefully not to push that too far, the anti-Chinese agenda. But I mean, in a way, it does. So anyway, I've touched on quite a few points, but I think that I don't know if that answers your question satisfactorily, but. So it's kind of a regional hegemon, but in a global scale is kind of a junior partner of the US. But on the local level, it is kind of the dominant power. So that, I guess, would sum up Australia's role.
And Lorenz, when we say the Pacific Islands, is it possible to say how many of those islands we are speaking about? Because when people say Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, there is always Pacific. But we don't really know how many countries or how many, or what's the population, or how does it work?
Sure. Okay, now that is, of course, quite complicated. But when I'm saying, so of course, we have the terms Pacific and Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific, and these are all normally encompass large parts of the world and don't really treat the island states in the Pacific as at the center, right? If we're talking about Indo-Pacific, we think about pretty much from the east coast of the US to the west coast of Africa, and we don't really talk too much about the small island states. And Asia Pacific, of course, even less. That's just Asia and some of the kind of offshore islands like Japan and Indonesia, like, big, heavily populated islands next to Asia. But what I'm talking about when we talk about the Pacific region, like the Pacific Island region, we mean the kind of the island states, the island nations that are kind of in the center of the Pacific. Now, these are, if you look at the overall, I guess geographically, we deal with like thousands of islands. Now, in terms of states or entities, there are overall 27 political entities in the region. Of those, I think four, if I'm not, I may be mistaken, but I think 14 of them are independent states, are sovereign states. And the other remaining ones are dependent territories, or I guess colonial territories, if you want to say so. But so now in terms of population, I mean, again, there's a vast difference in scale even between these states. So we have, for example, a relatively large country that is Papua New Guinea, right? That's half of a large continental-sized island, several hundred kilometers in both directions of landmass. That has, probably around 10 million or so people. That is that's significantly big. That's like a major, large kind of developing country, maybe comparable to those in Africa or some of the poorer parts of Asia. But then we have most of the other island states are really small on a global scale. They are like normally like Fiji, where I live, has about 1 million inhabitants. That's considered big. Other island states have less than 1 million. Solomon Islands has 700,000. Tonga has 100,000, Samoa 200,000. So we're dealing with kind of relatively small island nations, all the way to some that are extremely small, like really small. Like Tuvalu, for example, has a land size that is just probably smaller than like a few blocks of the city of London, and has a number of inhabitants of about 12,000. So and Nauru has about the same number, 12,000, and also a size of just a few square kilometers. So we have like even like extremely small, real kind of micro island states on one end of the spectrum, and we have kind of, I guess, medium-sized developed countries like Papua New Guinea, and then pretty much everywhere in everything in between. So even within the region, there's a big diversity of the size and scales and kind of like economic clout in that way of these states, of these island states.
Do people consider Australia as a Western power?
Generally, yes. I mean, certainly, I would say that is, just the fact that the way its demographic makeup, the large majority of it being of British descent, and the institutions that they have inherited from the British colonial era, I would say Australia is generally considered a Western power. Of course, that depends on how you define Western. That's another question, but it's certainly both in its kind of the Western liberal Anglo traditions that have shaped its political institutions, and also its alliance being like with the US and kind of with the Western bloc, both in the Cold War and I guess now in this reshaped multipolar world, where it also is of course very strongly siding with the Western powers, like with the US mainly, EU, other countries. So
let's complete this landscape with the interests of big powers such as United States, China, maybe European Union, based also on your research. How you understand the interest of those big powers.
Well, I mean, I would say there is, of course, I guess like everywhere else in the world, a increased polarization between a Western bloc and its interests on one side, and I wouldn't say necessarily much of a bloc here in the Pacific, because it's really only China that is a major influence of all the BRICS states, I guess, of that other bloc maybe that's forming around China. But certainly there's China on one side, and there are the Western powers on the other. And I would say the Western powers generally are rather cooperative with each other. So, for example, the US obviously is more involved in development aid and those kind of things in the northern half of the region, whereas Australia is more in the south, and they seem to be relatively much kind of in sync with the way that they're not competitors for sure. The EU is somewhere kind of in between, or maybe I'll get to that in the next point. Because it's more difficult or more complicated, I guess. But certainly Australia and the US are relatively well collaborating with each other. And on the other side, there's China that has, of course, its own interests. And I would say that are generally much less militaristic and more trade-based. I mean, I don't, despite some rumors that are being spread by certain kind of journalistic propaganda machines from the West, I don't really see a big Chinese military presence or even kind of intent to create a kind of military presence, except for occasionally there are Chinese warships visiting. But I mean, that's like, even those are much less than Australian or American warships visiting. So, but I don't really see like I don't see big efforts on the Chinese side to establish kind of a militarized infrastructure in this region. What comes from China, I think, is more of a commercial and commercial and also infrastructure, like through the Belt and Road Initiative, those kind of things. So China has enormously invested in the region, both some government affiliated projects, but mainly, of course, private Chinese capital that is like has massively invested in many of the countries. And yeah, I guess the competition in the way is there that, of course, that Chinese influence is, of course, is dreaded by especially Australia and the US. And they are trying to kind of dissuade islands from becoming too close to China. Of course, it is more like, obviously Australia also being an ex-colonial power in some of the islands, like PNG, Papua New Guinea, for example, and also being kind of a neo-colonial dominant power. Like most of the big industries even like some of the import-export commercial, like supermarket chains, whatever, those kind of, a lot of companies are Australian that are operating in the region. So of course, in a way, Australia is kind of, tries to hold its position. And in the northern part of the region, the US does the same thing, having its military bases in the Philippines, in Micronesia, in Hawaii, and so on and so forth, and its dominance there. And so I think it's more like these countries are trying to maintain their economic and military dominance, whereas China is kind of the upcoming challenger that wants to, through its investments, become influential in the region as well. And then and Australia and New Zealand try the hardest they can to shut it out. So that, I would say, is maybe sums up the big powers.
You mentioned that EU was
yes.
complicated. Why?
Yes. Okay, so the EU is kind of complicated because, first of all, it obviously being a multinational entity, it does not necessarily always speak with one voice, and then of course has also quite different interests, each of the countries. The difference there is, of course, mainly, let's say, between France on one side and the other EU countries on the other, because France obviously has first of all, has a long tradition of being not fully allied with the West and always being a little bit, de Gaulle kind of half pulling out of NATO back in the 60s. And, France has a long history of trying to claim a status of a separate or like of its own geopolitical pole and not being fully integrated into the Western Anglo-Saxon alliance. And that, of course, still plays a role today. And then, of course, France also having, specifically in the Pacific, being a colonial power, owning, claiming sovereignty or still maintaining sovereignty over significant parts of the region. I mean, French Polynesia in the east and New Caledonia in the west, where we have recently had a lot of trouble and actually riots, just like last week, because of an anti-colonial movement that France is not really not taking well account of. So a long, complicated story. But so France, of course, has the interest in maintaining its colonial rule in the region, and therefore, maintaining these. And the same thing, like in the Indian Ocean and in the Caribbean. Like France wants to maintain its colonial outposts, so it can still claim, despite its increasingly small size of overall population, right? It's now less than 1% of the world's population, and yet it tries to maintain this great power status, UN security, veto power, and all of that by claiming this kind of, by maintaining this kind of chain of micro colonies all over the world. And so, of course, in that sense, France has this kind of strong interest of being a power in the region, whereas I guess maybe the other European powers obviously don't have that direct interest. Their interest is more to be involved in trade, to be their interest is more the outside power of a development partner that then gains influence by giving development aid and those kind of things. And then, of course, France has still, in the same sense as it has always done, sometimes made statements that are not in sync at all with the United States and also with Australia. Right. I mean, France has often said we are not part of this kind of Western alliance against China. We try to have a neutral position within this, right? Like he said, like Macron, the president, just 2 years ago, said that he would not get involved in this Taiwan issue if the US gets involved in it, for example, right? So those kind of things, which some other EU countries that are closer allied to the US, kind of criticized him for, right? So I guess in that sense, the EU, France specifically, but then also the other EU countries have, I guess somewhat more divergent interests that are not necessarily as clearly aligned with kind of the Western bloc as, let's say, Australia is with the US. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. But otherwise, I mean, I guess the general interest is similar. I mean, of course, it's trade. It's like also, it's definitely anti-China. Overall, it is anti-China. Even the French, I mean, because what they say in their colonial territories is kind of the same thing. They spin this kind of propaganda that, if we leave, the Chinese will come in. So do you want to live under the Chinese? So you better stay with us. So it's kind of some of that. So they do some of that rhetoric too. It's just on the international stage. Then they say, oh, no, we are not part of the Western bloc. We want to be neutral. So the French kind of play it kind of both ways in a way.
What about so-called emerging powers? In the West, we often speak about emerging powers such as India, Turkey, and other countries, countries from the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, for instance. So do you see any interest coming from those actors to your region?
Yes. Not at a large scale yet, but I mean, they are increasingly visible. I guess, especially here in Fiji, and probably here in Fiji more than in any other countries, because Fiji has unlike any other Pacific Island countries, Fiji has a large Indian diaspora population, right? Fiji is one of the countries like Mauritius, like Trinidad, like Guyana, where the British colonizers brought in a lot of Indian laborers as sugar plantation laborers, and their descendants are still here, and they form a significant part of the population. That was also part of why there has been some ethnic conflicts in the past in Fiji. But so the Indo-Fijians are now about 40% of the population, or maybe 35, something like that. So they're definitely a very significant minority. And so because of their presence, you have, of course, India has always had a vested interest in Fiji, even before already. But now that India is emerging on the global scale, there is, of course, some interests coming from India. There had been Mahendra Modi was in Fiji just a few years ago and had like the first time an India Pacific Island Summit here in Suva. That was kind of a first. It never happened before. I think the interest of the other smaller islands was rather limited, but certainly here for Fiji, that is important. And I see now that there are a lot of, just like 10 years ago, pretty much all the cheap stuff was made in China. Now, like half of the cheap stuff is made in India. Like you see that in the stores here, that the trade volume with India has apparently significantly increased. So that is quite. So India does play a role in that sense. Also, I think through Fiji, some of the Middle Eastern countries, like Pakistan and some other Islamic countries, have played a role because of a part of the Indo-Fijians are Muslims, so there is some connection through that as well. And I think in general, some of the Gulf states have also occasionally expressed some interest and sometimes also funded, on a limited scale, but there has been funding by the UAE and by I'm not sure of Qatar as well, but definitely from the United Arab Emirates there has been some investments here, and Turkey probably least of all. I haven't really seen much from Turkey. However, I have seen, that's quite interesting. There was very recently during these riots in New Caledonia. That's the first time I actually have even had that on my radar, is that Azerbaijan, for some reason, has actually supported has created an initiative to support anti-colonial movements within the French overseas territories, not just in the Pacific but also in the Caribbean. So I mean, these are just blurbs here and there. I mean, I'm not saying that's like of really great significance, but there is certainly emerging powers, being interested in the region. Indonesia also, which is of course neighboring because it's right there on the I guess the the western margins of the region. Indonesia has also a quite strong presence, both just trade in general, but also politically, because the western half of New Guinea Island, right, West Papua, or formerly called Irian Jaya, is historically has become part of Indonesia through a contested process. And many of the people there are like, they fight for independence against Indonesia. They want to rather join the other half of New Guinea for, I guess, logical, ethnographic, geographical reasons. And Indonesia obviously wants to prevent that. So Indonesia has and a lot of Pacific Island populations are sympathetic with West Papuans. And so Indonesia also tries to, become itself influential, so it can then kind of, also kind of try to kind of, I guess, derail that support for West Papuan independence. And that's one motive, but I think it's also the general motive of Indonesia to be like a kind of a South-South developing partner for other smaller countries in the global South, and kind of, in this kind of Bandung spirit, support other developing countries. So you see quite a few made in Indonesia products sometimes in the stores. I've noticed that too. So yes, in general, there are, emerging powers are slowly making their ways into this part of the region as well.
Many people, they speak about multilateral initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, and there are many of them, from ranging from the trade, military, and culture as well. But not many people know about the Pacific Islands Forum as a platform, as an organization. So can you please tell us more about how this organization works? Maybe based on your critical review, some achievements, some outcomes, so we can better understand it.
Sure. Yeah. So the Pacific Island Forum is kind of, I guess, the main regional body or regional organization, I guess, that plays, somewhat of a role, I guess, somewhat comparable to ASEAN in Southeast Asia or to the African Union in Africa. So it's kind of operating somewhere along those lines. It definitely does not move towards kind of integration the way that the EU works. It doesn't really have a supranational government and much of a bureaucracy. It does have the forum secretariat, and there's probably 100 or 200 employees or something altogether, but it's definitely nothing that's trying to become a Pacific Brussels. So just take that out of the way. But so it is, and it was founded in the 1970s when the first group of post-colonial countries had achieved their independence. Fiji, Tonga, which was already kind of independent, was only a protectorate. The Cook Islands, Samoa, and Nauru. So those 5 early independent countries, and then, but also Australia and New Zealand, who's of course now coming back to that what I said first, whose role has kind of always been contested, because in a way they are the money donors for this. They keep this whole operation going because they, as developed countries, do have the money to spend on that, whereas most of the developing small island countries don't have necessarily that money. So they are in a way important as donors, but then of course their role as being kind of European, like Western states, with the majority of white Anglo-Saxon descendants, of course their role then is often kind of contested by some of the island nation leaders. And that is that. So that's pretty much the history. And then the organization has pretty much comprises all independent states of the region. It now also includes the 2 French overseas territories in a somewhat contested way, because it in a way contradicts their own statutes that actually say it's only open to fully independent countries. But they were also so their like local governments are kind of there, but they in a way have to get the permission from France to speak. So it's a little complicated situation in terms of international law. But anyway, so it is, but it's mainly the independent post-colonial states plus Australia and New Zealand. Like I said, they have annual meetings. They have an annual forum, like the full plenary meeting of the forum, where the heads of government of all states meet and discuss important issues of the region. Produce an annual communique that should then be kind of the guidance for regional policy for the next year. They also have a secretariat that is kind of produces policies for like regional cooperation. They also work in partnership with other regional organizations that are that are specific to that are task specific. Like the Foreign Fisheries Agency, for example, those kinds of like various kind of technical subdivisions that they have. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much what I could say now. Like I said, there has been some contestation. Right now it looks like it is back to where it was before. It is really the central regional organization, but that was not always the case. There were two big challenges to it in the 2010s. Fiji was actually expelled because Fiji had gone through a military coup and being kind of a non-democratic government at that time. Australia and New Zealand really, and some of the island states too, but not all, insisted on Fiji being like no longer democracy and therefore expelled from it. And then Fiji, first of all, increased its cooperation with other non-Western states during that time, including China and Russia and several others. But it also, more importantly, just like said, okay, well, if you don't want us anymore, we form our own. So Fiji then formed a separate, like an alternative organization called the PIDF, Pacific Island Development Forum, that would have only the island states as members and not Australia and New Zealand, would be funded mainly from China and the Middle East and some other non-Western countries, and then trying to create a kind of a trust fund where the money, where the organization could eventually just like fund itself. But the main money coming from, I think, China and United Arab Emirates, the first kind of batch of it. So that was kind of Fiji's initiative at the time, but it didn't really go far because after Fiji did return to parliamentary democracy and the military leader who had been the coup leader was re-elected in the democratic election, so then Australia and New Zealand dropped their sanctions against Fiji, and then Fiji was essentially slowly kind of moved back into the forum, and this whole initiative kind of this alternative forum kind of is kind of dying a slow death, I would say. It's barely, it's still there, the building is still there, they still have somebody who is the secretary, but for all intents and purposes, it is pretty much dead. A second challenge to the forum was in 2021, when during COVID, they had a virtual meeting. Obviously, they didn't have a physical meeting, and then they decided on the new Secretary General, which normally would be discussed in a consensus, right? They would have a retreat, and then they would kind of consensually decide. During this COVID situation, it wasn't possible. So what they did is instead they did a vote. They voted, and by country, and then the choice fell on somebody who was from the Polynesian subregion and not from the Micronesian subregion. And there's a lot of competition too between Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, these three subregions. And the Micronesian understanding was that it should be rotating between three regions, and a Micronesian individual should be the new Secretary General. Instead, that Polynesian guy, Henry Puna of the Cook Islands, became the secretary. And then the Micronesian states collectively decided to withdraw from the forum. Now, it took about a year for most of them to return, because eventually Mr. Puna said he would resign and not run for a renomination. And then Kiribati, which is one Micronesian country, Kiribati maintained actually that it would withdraw. It still didn't come back for a long time. And only last year in 2023, finally, the new Prime Minister of Fiji went to Kiribati, did a kind of traditional pardon, like a traditional forgiveness ceremony, and then eventually Kiribati also rejoined the forum. So this, like both of these splits and problems, I guess, that we had in the 2010s and the early 2020s have now seemed to have been repaired, and now the forum has once again found its unity as being kind of the only real regional organization.
That sounds like a very interesting story, and also, for research, excellent topic as well. The last question for this block about geopolitics and organizations in the region: what is the Russian involvement in the region?
Of course, let's go back a little bit. The Soviet Union had tried to, back in the 1970s and 80s, had tried to make agreements with the newly independent Pacific Island countries, especially for fisheries. Like also the Soviet Union had already had quite important fishing fleets. It did make some agreements with several Pacific Island countries, so there was kind of a Soviet presence through like Vladivostok, and obviously never forget that Russia has actually larger Pacific coastline than it has a border with NATO. That sometimes gets kind of lost in the Eurocentric geopolitical discussions. Right, Russia has about 3,000 kilometers of coastline on the Pacific Ocean. That was the Soviet part. Then there was obviously after the Yeltsin era and early Putin era, there was very little because Russia was just self-absorbed in its own problems, and there was not that much, I think, active diplomacy coming out of Russia that I'm aware of. However, in the 2010s, when this whole situation that I just talked about, when Fiji was kicked out of the forum and was kind of essentially put under sanctions because of being led by a military government by Australia and New Zealand, and Fiji turned to other alternative development partners. And one of the partners it did turn to was Russia at the time. That was around 2009, 10, 11, 12, during that time. So it was essentially during Medvedev's presidency. And during that time, actually, Prime Minister Bainimarama, or like the interim Prime Minister, the military ruler at that time of Fiji, he participated in one of these 9th of May celebrations in Moscow. He was a guest of honor with Medvedev at that time. There was quite an interesting, quite a high level relationship. Also, the Fijian military at that time procured a lot of equipment from Russia during that time, around 2010. Again, because Australia and New Zealand would also stop its defense cooperation with Fiji, so then they just turned to Russia for that reason. And then the other university, we have 3 universities here in Fiji. Mine, that's the University of the South Pacific, the University of Fiji, and then the newest one, Fiji National University, FNU, that was founded kind of just like 10 years ago, approximately. And that one, at that time, also made an agreement with research exchange with Vladivostok State University. And maybe quite interesting too, as you are aware, how Russia is very hard about always has been about its visa and its immigration purposes, right? And Russia grants very few countries visa waiver agreements. It has always been like that. But Fiji and Russia at that time made a mutual visa waiver agreement. So Russian citizens can travel to Fiji without a visa, and so can Fijian citizens to Russia. So there was this very close relationship during that time. Now, I'm not sure how far this has really remained, because, as I said, it was also from Fiji's point of view probably a more of an opportunistic situation, because, like I said, they were cut out by Australia and New Zealand for ideological reasons, and then they just turned to whoever would they would trade with them and have relations with them. After the invasion of Ukraine, just one step back. So in that time, also Fiji voted in the UN, for example. It didn't vote to condemn the annexation of Crimea. It insisted on abstaining. Quite interesting. But then in 2022, when the Ukrainian invasion and then later the supposed annexation of the eastern Ukrainian territories happened, Fiji actually voted against. It voted with the Western Bloc against. It did not even abstain and vote against. So it was kind of during that 2022, Fiji started to more clearly align itself with the West, I guess, in that sense. And it also did, quite surprisingly, actually to me, quite surprisingly, for a non-aligned country, it did indirectly implement anti-Russian sanctions, even though it was not formally part of the sanctions regime. But when there was a yacht, like one of these luxury yachts owned by a kind of, so-called oligarch, Russian billionaire, who was on some kind of sanctions list by the US. And the US asked Fiji to seize this yacht, and Fiji did it. Fiji did seize the yacht and turn it over to the US, which is, in terms of sovereignty, quite surprising, because I think since Fiji didn't join, Fiji was of course under no obligation to do that because it wasn't part of the sanctions regime, but it did. So I'm not sure how much that has offended Russia and how much Russia still maintains like the visa waiver and all these exchange agreements of the 2010s. I have no idea. I don't know. Just haven't really heard much from Russia and about Russian relations lately. So I guess that would be just some of these anecdotes would tell you about the relationship that Russia has with the region. I guess one more thing that is quite interesting, another anecdote, the small country of Nauru, which is, by the way, far from being a Russian ally, is also a very close ally of Australia, because Australia has its the detention center for asylum seekers kind of relocated into Nauru. So everybody who gets caught by the Australian Coast Guard is being interned in Nauru, and then they take up to 20 years to process their asylum request. Quite horrible story actually for these poor people. But that's on Nauru Island. So Nauru is in a way very much beholden to Australia. But then, for some reason, Nauru is also, in a way, has always been close to Russia for some reason. And Nauru is one of 3 countries in the world that recognizes these breakaway republics in Georgia, or like Abkhazia and Southeast Asia. They're recognized by Russia itself, obviously, but also only by 3 other countries, which is Nicaragua and Venezuela, obviously close allies of Russia, and by Nauru, even though it's very clearly an ally of Australia and pretty much every other geopolitical question. So that is quite interesting that Nauru for some reason this kind of interest in supporting these Georgian breakaway countries that are supported by Russia. So yeah, there's some kind of interesting connection with Russia there too through Nauru.
Let's just briefly explain maybe some main challenges and opportunities in the economic diplomacy of oceanic countries and region.
Well, I mean, it's of course, I think, some of the main challenges, of course, for the region is that, just to generate enough income to sustain a state apparatus in a relatively small country with a low number of population. That is certainly, especially for the smaller countries, is always a challenge. And they are able to do that mainly with aid grants, but of course they always try to move away from that and attract kind of some investments to create an economy that would actually then generate the money to sustain their stately existence without depending on grants. So that's pretty much, I would say, the general struggle. And I mean, in some countries that has worked relatively well through tourism. I mean, tourism is, of course, obviously with a heavy and quite horrible interruption during COVID that has had tremendously bad consequences. But I guess both before and now after COVID, some countries have been able to to negotiate visa waiver agreements with various countries, especially Australia, New Zealand, but US, some East Asia too, Japan, China is nowadays as well. And so tourism, of course, is an important factor. Also, fisheries, of course, these countries are like, one of the terms that is being used now is instead of small island states to say large ocean states, because of these huge EEZ, right, exclusive economic zones. By EEZs, some of these countries are like among the largest in the world. Like some of them have several million square kilometers of maritime space. And so, of course, fisheries and trying to negotiate with foreign countries, because most countries don't have the fishing fleets to fish their entire territory, obviously, but making agreements and making useful and sustainable agreements with foreign fishing companies that the islands can then profit from is that would be another important part of that. Some of the Melanesian countries also have important mining industries, and Papua New Guinea, especially Papua New Guinea, exports a lot of silver, gold, copper, like lithium now for like those kind of things, right? And also crude oil. There's oil, petrol sources there as well, and LNGs, liquefied natural gas. So Papua New Guinea and some of the other Melanesian countries, Solomons to some smaller amount as well. And then the French territory of New Caledonia, even though it's not an independent state, it has a huge nickel mining complex that's really important at a global level. It has like about, depending on definitions, but maybe 1/5 or so of the world's nickel reserves, at least the accessible ones, are in New Caledonia. So on the kind of the western side, you do have some really important strategic minerals, but I guess with the rest, it's mainly trying to, I think the main economic diplomacy is about getting a constant flow of tourists and being able to manage the fisheries in a sustainable way. That would be probably the main economic interests for the countries.
You also mentioned foreign aid when you were
Yes.
speaking. How is this present at the moment, and are there any challenges, coming out of this foreign aid? Because we know the case studies mainly from Africa, how the foreign aid works in practice in positive and negative way. So how is the situation in your region?
I mean, there is certainly a huge dependency on foreign like I said, except maybe for Papua New Guinea that has all these mineral resources, and then maybe some of the smaller countries that have like an extremely lucrative tourism business. But I would say in general, most of the Pacific Island countries are definitely dependent. Like they could not, their national annual budget could not operate if it wasn't for a significant amount of foreign aid that would be injected there. So that is certainly it's extremely important for these small states to maintain their state apparatus. But of course, that also means that they are tremendously dependent on whoever is the main donor or the main either direct aid, or if it's concessional loans, either way, right? Either loans or grants. And of course, whoever is the biggest donor or the biggest debtor is, of course, also becomes then politically quite influential. So, for example, what I just mentioned about Australia, like Australia being kind of a regional hegemon and being not necessarily always liked that well by island states because of its certain arrogance that they are perceived, and also the way that they have been, very much supporting of fossil fuels and coal, when in fact the island countries' agenda is to support like a carbon-free economy because of climate change and being threatened by the rising sea levels. And then the fact that Australia mainly can get away with all of that because many of the smaller countries are depending on Australian aid, so they rather like don't scream too much because then Australia may withdraw the aid, and Australia knows that, so therefore they can also, it does create dependencies. And of course, with some other countries, it creates dependencies on China because China may be the major donor or maybe the major debtor. So that is, certainly these foreign aid creates dependencies, and I think countries are best advised to not put all their eggs in one basket and have like kind of compose their aid landscape and their debt landscape diversified. And most countries are trying to do that, but not all of them that successfully, because some of them are just like are very much dependent just on one donor. So yeah, that's the main challenge, I guess.
You mentioned rising sea levels, which is closely connected to climate change.
Yes.
And how can we understand climate change in your region?
Okay, so there are pretty much, I think, two things. There are two phenomena that are very clearly visible. One is that sea levels seem to be rising in most parts. Maybe not as dramatically. Not like literally, just like places sinking right away here and there, but certainly there seems to be a slow increase of the overall sea level, and especially there are also more extreme weather events. That's probably the more visible one. That the number of cyclones, tropical cyclones, has increased in there. There's nowadays like almost every year there's at least one category 5 tropical cyclone somewhere. That wasn't the case in the 1970s and 80s. Well, 80s had a few, but then 90s barely had any. So it looks like it's like, there's an accumulation of these tropical cyclones that create tremendous damage. I've been through one while I was in Tonga. I was never so afraid of. I guess I'm fortunate to have never lived in a war or in any serious calamity. But this was like the closest to me fearing for my life was being in this Category 5 cyclone and seeing like being in the house and like pieces of other houses flying around the house. That was kind of really scary. And that certainly these extreme weather events, and then kind of each of these extreme weather events also means that there's more erosion. So maybe the sea levels are not visibly are not yet visibly increasing that high. It's not like, the high water mark is now like 20 centimeters higher than it was like last year. It's not as dramatic, but every time there's an extreme weather event, normally the coastline recedes a little bit more, right? And then some of the small atolls, like you have to understand, some countries like Kiribati or Tuvalu, they consist of atolls, meaning the entire land base of the country consists of coral islands that are no higher than 3 meters above the sea level, and then are like a maximum of a few hundred meters wide between the lagoon in the middle and the open ocean on the other side. You can imagine if there are extreme weather events and the island kind of loses just a few meters of land, then that's kind of can be catastrophic in the long run. So I mean, so it's kind of these dramatic events of people losing, especially coastal people on the high islands, that they have to move inland, or atoll people that just don't have anywhere to move, kind of losing their habitat, or I mean, losing their their dwellings. That is certainly something that's being debated. And then I guess I mean, that's the phenomenon side, and then on the activism side, or on the kind of demand side, it is really that Pacific Islands are very much, and that's something that's really a consensus that everybody agrees on, is that pretty much all Pacific Island governments, with no exception, they agree that the kind of big polluters, the big carbon emitters in the world, need to be pressured to put a stop to that. I mean, there's like probably no other region is so united in unison that this Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees maximum, and those kind of things need to be implemented. And the Pacific Islands at the UN or at these global climate conferences are very clearly in unison making those demands. So that is, kind of what we see in diplomacy coming out of the island states.
And how active are countries in this diplomacy, based on your opinion?
Oh, I think they're very active. That's probably the most, I would say, that's the one field in which Pacific Islands are like disproportionately active, right? I mean, if you look at that, they present, like 0.something% of the world's population, maybe a little bit more in their EEZ size, but even then, it's not like, it's obviously not like Africa, or not like Asia. It's not a huge part of the world in terms of population and economic force. But and of course, I guess most of the diplomacy is kind of is at the scale of their global importance in terms of size and economic power. But the one field on which they're disproportionately active is on this climate issue. Like every time there is a UN conference or any kind of international meeting that is about climate change and fight against climate change, carbon emission caps, and all those kind of things. Each of these climate-based meetings, Pacific Island diplomats will be present. They will be strongly present. They will be vocal. So yeah, they're very active. That's probably like I said, the field that they are most active in globally.
Right. What about energy security and climate change in the Pacific Islands? For instance, do you see any new projects coming up to the islands with renewable energies, or it is more about export-import, so the fossil fuels or LNG, how is it?
Significant part of the energy is actually generated by burning imported petrol. So that is in a way, of course, a contradiction but I think people are also, governments are increasingly aware of that contradiction and are trying to replace those with renewable energies. One thing is that on the high volcanic islands, there is a lot of hydropower. For example, here in Fiji, most of our electricity, I think at least here in eastern Fiji, is, I think, produced through a big hydroelectric dam in the middle of the island, or 50 kilometers up the rivers. A huge dam that's has a huge, that artificial lake is about 10 kilometers long or so. So, there's hydropower in most of the high mountainous islands. And then I think in some of the coastal areas, there are increasing amounts of solar installations being built. And I guess in smaller islands, that is significant, like in a place like Tonga, which is a flat coral island. It has huge solar farms now. You can see that even on Google Maps, like large areas, like up to like 1 square kilometer or so covered in solar panels. And I think they're increasingly aware of trying to get away from fossil fuel electricity generation and replace them with renewable energies. So how much I'm not an engineer, not into, this is not my field of research. So I can't give you precise statistics, but it is certainly something that I think most other governments are now trying to work on, to move away from fossil fuel burning towards renewable energies.
Great. In the last sections of the interview, let's speak about Fiji, because this is where you live and we can highlight few important updates and details about Fiji. Let's start with a sort of holistic perspective. What's the position of Fiji in the Pacific Islands, as a region? How can we understand the country? And maybe you can tell us about a few trends, how this country is developing, to which initiatives or which maybe movements or political thoughts?
Well, so first of all, it is. Fiji has always been, ever since British colonial periods, has been kind of the most developed and most dynamic economically of all the small Pacific Island states. Of course, not including Australia and New Zealand, right? But of the island nations, Fiji has always been the most developed. It does have a relatively diversified economy. It does have quite a few like small local level manufacturing. You have factories here that produce all kind of small things like consumer goods, food items, packaged like cookies, biscuits, those kind of things are made locally. There's a cement factory here that makes cement, which means building your house is relatively affordable. And many smaller countries don't have that at all. They pretty much have to import every single thing that is not coming out of the ground or out of the ocean, right? Some of the smaller countries, they just don't have the capacity to produce anything. So in that sense, because Fiji has a significant manufacturing industry, they have a clothing industry too, like all these beautiful shirts that I wear, they are actually made in Fiji. Whereas in other countries, they're all imported from overseas because they don't have a clothing industry, right? So Fiji has this kind of relatively diversified economy that makes it somewhat of the leader, I would say, in the region. Of course, it's also relatively large. It has a landmass of about 20,000 square kilometers, which is probably half the size of Belgium. So it's obviously small for Europe, but still it's not a micro state. It's quite significant. Like the main island you take, it's 200 kilometers in diameter. So you have to it takes 2 days to drive around it. So it's not a small island state. And so with that landmass, with it about almost 1 million people, Fiji has, of course, I guess, more chances of developing into like a modern economy than some of the smaller states that pretty much just don't have that perspective. They need to always rely on some kind of interconnection with others. So Fiji has some more, I guess, tendency towards autarky. So that's a good thing. And I guess because of that, it also has always tried to kind of play a leadership role in the region, again, because of being relatively large, being relatively economically successful, and relatively also less dependent on aid than other. Not saying independent of it, it still gets a lot of aid, but significantly less aid than any of the other island nations. So Fiji has played this kind of leading role. I guess also from different angles during the time when Fiji was expelled from the forum, and it played this kind of active global south kind of, or this active kind of alternative emerging power multipolarity kind of policy with China and India and Russia and others. So during that time, it kind of became in a way naturally a leader for the region to seek out alternative avenues of connections. And many other smaller island nations kind of followed suit, and they were actually happy Fiji was doing that, and they were they were kind of accepting that kind of leadership role. Now, some others didn't. Some others were either very much beholden to Australia and New Zealand, or they were just independently too proud of themselves to accept that. Either way, but Fiji has always had this kind of leadership role, and of course, it also does have it because of all the regional organizations are in Fiji. Right, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat is here. All of the UN agencies, if they are in the Pacific at all, they all have their offices here in Suva. The EU has an office here. It doesn't have it anywhere else. There are more embassies and consuls here than in any other Pacific Island nation. So in that sense, it is kind of a hub. It's a regional hub, and it also tries to take leadership role, even though that may be contested. So I guess that would
at the current time, and this is like 2024 that we are recording this. What would you say are the most significant challenges for Fiji in international relations?
Well, I would not say that there's any really specific conflict that Fiji is involved in. I would just say there are of course the geopolitical tensions in the Pacific, or in the so-called Indo-Pacific, as is such a fashionable term now. I actually like it, but for different reasons, not for the same reasons that some of the Western media like it. Maybe we can talk that another time. But this Indo-Pacific theater, so to say, there is of course this increasing competition of U.S. and its allies against China, and that is of course kind of a challenge because it creates unnecessary unnecessary complications for island governments, as for Fiji as well as for many others, because the interest of both Fiji and most of the other island nations is just to be, that's the like officially stated government policy, to be friends to all, enemies to none. And that is really what Pacific Islands want. They want to maximize kind of relations and networks within this emerging multipolar world order, and not be forced to make choices. And unfortunately, some countries, and I would say the Western ones more than China, to be honest, is trying to force them to, or like trying to convince them, or maybe even try to force them to take a side and pronounce themselves kind of join kind of the Western camp against China. And I think this is something that the islands in their foreign policy are kind of suffering from. And kind of, that they have to constantly engage with this kind of this pressure from like Western nations to join their camp against China, which they don't want. Of course, on the other side, you have two or three, well, that's not Fiji, but like two or three that recognize Taiwan instead of the PRC. And they are, of course, under strong pressure from China to change that and drop Taiwan and recognize the PRC as the legitimate China. So I guess that's, there is some pressure from China in that sense as well. But I think overall, the pressure is definitely much stronger from the Western side to pronounce themselves more strongly against Beijing and pro-West. So that to me is probably the main challenge that Fiji, just as much as any other country, has to deal with in its international relations. I would say that's kind of the main thing. And of course, also, I would say still like this kind of question of this kind of still kind of unresolved issue with like what really Australia and New Zealand's role is in the region, because they are also always kind of trying to play, I mean, both, and then it depends also who is, whether the right or the center right or the center left is in power, then it gets, one of them gets stronger than the other. And right now we have the center right in New Zealand, the center left in Australia, but it's normally for some reason always the other way across the Tasman Sea. And so, but to some extent, both of these powers they play this kind of ambiguous double role, where they consider themselves to be like the leading countries of the region, when they are, of course, being like mainly European-dominated countries, are not really accepted as such, but by the island countries. Yet at the same time, obviously, the island countries depend on them for their aid, also for their diaspora. A lot of Pacific Islanders live in Australia and New Zealand as guest workers, right? So there's, of course, this mutual dependency, but Australia and New Zealand, they kind of play on that in a way to take this leadership. But then in the international affairs, and on the international level, Australia and New Zealand often play, they're much more allied clearly with the West and not so much with the island countries that they're supposedly being the big brother of, right? So, I mean, that often creates kind of tensions. Like I said, like when Australia is talking about being like our Pacific family and whatever, and then lashing out against Solomon Islands for making a security agreement with China, and then yet that same Australia that has just talked about their Pacific family that needs to be protected against China, voting or trying to water down the Paris Agreement, or trying to water down kind of climate change resolutions because of its own coal industry that they're trying to protect, right? So it's those kind of things that make many Pacific Island governments very ambiguous in the way they see Australia and New Zealand. And that also, of course, is a challenge for them, how to position themselves, how to kind of keep kind of friendship with them, but also be critical of these kind of things. So, yeah, I guess, in this more increasingly complicated multipolar geopolitical situation, Pacific countries have to treading on eggshells in order to try to position themselves. So that would be, I guess, my main summary of what's happening and what's going on.
The last question for today's interview, Lorenz. You are teaching at the University of the South Pacific. And, when we speak about the island, we usually don't think about academic life, research, international relations, political science. So can you tell us, what is the interest of local people to study and to be involved in international relations?
I guess maybe from two angles. One thing is that people want to significantly involve themselves in both in civil society and in maybe even in active politics. especially given the fact that Fiji has such complicated political histories and had this coup culture, all these different military coups and kind of trouble. And a lot of people are very much aware of the importance of like democracy and political participation. And they're very kind of, they're very strong about that. And they want to go and study politics to understand that better. That's one element. Maybe more specifically for Fiji, which I guess in other countries with more consensual politics and less trouble in the past, maybe you don't have that much of that same interest. But certainly here in Fiji, you have that. But then I would say what I just mentioned, this importance of climate diplomacy, like of fighting against climate change and pushing like the island's interests on the global level, kind of becoming a kind of either an activist in an NGO or even a political lobbyist or like a political diplomat even, or like somehow involved in this kind of process to go to lobby for like the interests of island states not to be left out in this climate debate. I think that is a very important motivating factor for young people here in the region. I'm seeing that very clearly among my students as well.
Lorenz, thank you very much for your time, insightful thoughts and remarks, and all those interesting facts that you shared with us. It's not every day that we have someone from the Pacific Islands on the show, and I am very happy that I was able to, to get in touch with you and we were able to develop this episode, because it's so important to listen to the local voice when it comes to Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific. Very often we have the Western European, American perspectives, which is okay. There is nothing wrong with that. But for diversity of research, that's super important to hear the local voices. And I'm very, very thankful for your time. And wish you all the luck with your research, with your publications, work at the university, with your students. And thank you again for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you very much, Martin. Me too. I appreciate very much being invited to be part of your project and being able to share some of my thoughts, maybe with a wider community than my normal student body. So yeah, thank you as well. And same thing. Good luck with your research. All the things that you are working on. I appreciate very much your interest in like geopolitics from a global perspective. So yeah, thank you again as well, Martin.
Thank you.